When Captain Pollard was finally rescued after 90 days at sea, he was found gnawing on the bones of a dead crew member, a horrifying final act of survival. This was the result of a nightmare unleashed when a vengeful whale attacked the Essex in 1820. Join me as we explore three devastating Victorian maritime disasters that exposed different facets of Victorian society and ultimately led to profound changes in maritime safety, environmental policy, and ethical codes of conduct. You might think maritime safety regulations were always common sense, but you'd be forgiven for not realizing that each sensible measure we take for granted today was written in blood. By the end of our journey together, you'll understand how these forgotten tragedies forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, duty, and environmental negligence, and how their legacy lives on in modern practice.
The Essex disaster. When nature strikes back.
In 1820, the whaling industry was at its height. Ships from Nantucket, like the 238-ton Essex, ventured thousands of miles into the Pacific in pursuit of the valuable sperm whale, whose oil lit the lamps of the developing world. Picture this: the Essex setting sail in August 1819 under the command of 28-year-old Captain George Pollard, with 22-year-old first mate Owen Chase as his second in command. The crew of 20 men expected a routine, if arduous, voyage. By November 1820, the Essex had reached waters 2,000 miles west of South America. The crew had already harvested oil from several whales, but they were hungry for more. You see, in the whaling business, success wasn't measured in survival. It was measured in barrels of oil, and that relentless pursuit of profit would soon lead them into uncharted moral waters. On November 20th, 1820, the Essex's whaling boats were pursuing a pod of whales when the unthinkable happened. A massive bull sperm whale, which first mate Chase later described as 85 feet long, surfaced near the ship and began behaving strangely. According to Chase's account, the whale turned and positioned itself ahead of the ship, then suddenly charged, deliberately ramming the Essex on its port side. As the stunned crew attempted to assess the damage, the whale struck again, this time with even greater force, smashing a hole in the ship's bow. First mate Chase wrote,
"He turned short round and made directly for us at the rate of 6 knots and with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The ship was then going about 3 knots, when he came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head."
One might say the relationship between whalers and whales had been rather one-sided until that point. This particular whale, it seems, had decided to even the score. Within 10 minutes, it became clear the Essex was sinking. The crew salvaged what supplies they could and transferred to 3 small whaling boats, their only chance of survival in the vast Pacific. Captain Pollard faced an agonizing decision. The nearest known land was the Marquesas Islands, about 1,200 miles west. However, he had heard rumors that the islands were inhabited by cannibals. Instead, he chose to sail for South America, more than 3,000 miles away. For up to 95 days, the survivors drifted across the Pacific in their small boats, with different groups being rescued at different times. Their supplies quickly dwindled. They resorted first to drinking their own urine, then to eating the bodies of crewmates who had died. When that wasn't enough, they faced the ultimate moral dilemma. In Captain Pollard's boat, the men drew lots to determine who would be killed so the others could eat. Owen Coffin, the captain's 17-year-old cousin, drew the short straw. According to survivor accounts, Coffin accepted his fate with remarkable calm, saying, "I like my lot as well as any other." A crewmate shot him, and the survivors consumed his body. By the time rescue finally came, only 8 of the original 20 crew members had survived. When rescued, Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were delirious, still clutching the bones of their dead shipmates, reluctant to part with their only source of sustenance. The Essex disaster shocked the maritime world and the public. First Mate Owen Chase published his account in 1821, which later inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick, one of the most significant novels in American literature. Captain Pollard attempted to return to whaling, but was branded unlucky after losing a second ship. He spent the rest of his life as a night watchman in Nantucket, haunted by his experiences, rather like finding oneself demoted from brewing the finest tea at Buckingham Palace to watching the kettle in a roadside cafe. The Essex disaster forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable questions about the limits of survival ethics. Later, in 1884, the British case of R versus Dudley and Stevens, involving similar survival cannibalism, established the legal precedent that necessity is not a defense for murder. The Essex disaster had already brought public attention to the moral dilemmas of survival cannibalism decades earlier. The Essex disaster, along with other maritime tragedies of the era, contributed to the gradual development of maritime safety protocols, including provisions for emergency supplies and rescue procedures that evolved throughout the 19th century.
HMS Birkenhead. The birth of women and children first.
By 1852, Britain's empire was expanding rapidly across the globe. HMS Birkenhead, an iron-hulled troop ship, was transporting approximately 480 British soldiers to fight in the frontier wars in South Africa, along with approximately 26 women and children, families of the officers. Captain Robert Salmond commanded the ship, while Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Seaton of the 74th Regiment of Foot commanded the troops. As the Birkenhead steamed along the South African coast on February 26, 1852, it was carrying a total of about 638 people, many of them young soldiers heading to their first posting. You might imagine their excitement and trepidation as they sailed toward an uncertain future in a distant land. Little did they know that their greatest test of courage would come not on the battlefield, but on the deck of a sinking ship. At approximately 2 a.m., whilst most passengers were asleep, the Birkenhead struck an uncharted rock near Danger Point, about 87 miles from Cape Town. You'd think the name might have been a clue. The impact tore open the ship's forward compartments, and water rushed in. Captain Salmond ordered the anchors dropped and the engines reversed, a fatal mistake that caused even more damage to the hull. If there's one thing more dangerous than hitting a rock, it's hitting it twice. Captain Salmond's decision to reverse the engines was rather like trying to remove a knife from hard butter, by pushing it further in first. It quickly became apparent that the ship was sinking. The troops, many of them still in their night clothes, assembled on deck. Captain Salmond ordered everyone to the lifeboats, but there was an immediate problem. The Birkenhead carried lifeboats for only about 180 people, less than a third of those on board. The first lifeboat lowered was immediately swamped. The second was nearly crushed against the ship's side. In the growing chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Seaton made a fateful decision. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton, recognizing that a rush to the remaining lifeboats would endanger everyone, especially the women and children, gave an order that would echo through maritime history: stand fast. The soldiers, displaying extraordinary discipline, formed ranks on the deck of the sinking ship. Captain Wright, who survived the disaster, later wrote,
"The order and regularity that prevailed on board from the moment the ship struck till she totally disappeared far exceeded anything that I had thought could be effected by the best discipline."
As the women and children were loaded into the few serviceable lifeboats, the soldiers maintained their formation, knowing they were likely condemning themselves to death. Within 20 minutes of striking the rock, the Birkenhead broke in two, The front section sank immediately, taking many men with it. Those who remained on the rear section held their position until it too slipped beneath the waves. As the soldiers entered the water, they faced a new horror. The commotion had attracted numerous sharks. Many men were taken before they could swim to safety. Local accounts suggest that great white sharks in the region later gained the nickname Tommy sharks, or Tommies, after the British soldiers. Of the approximately 638 people aboard the Birkenhead, only 193 survived. Remarkably, every woman and child was saved thanks to the soldiers' sacrifice. One survivor, Cornet Ralph Shelton Bond, swam nearly 3 miles to shore. He would live until 1916, becoming the last living link to the disaster. News of the soldiers' discipline and sacrifice spread throughout Victorian society. King Frederick William IV of Prussia was so impressed that he had the account read to every regiment in his army as an example of courage and selflessness. While the Birkenhead disaster is often credited with establishing the Women and Children First protocol, later known as the Birkenhead Drill, this was celebrated as an exception at the time, not a pre-existing rule. The disaster led to significant improvements in ship design, including watertight compartments, and highlighted the need for sufficient lifeboats for all passengers, reforms that would save countless lives in future maritime emergencies.
The Princess Alice, drowning in London's toxic Thames.
By 1878, London was the largest city in the world, with a population of over 4 million. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the city, but this progress came with deadly consequences. The River Thames, once the lifeblood of London, had become an open sewer. Despite the construction of some sewage systems following the Great Stink of 1858, much of London's waste still poured directly into the river. For working-class Londoners, pleasure steamers offered a rare escape from the city's pollution and crowding. These vessels would take passengers downriver to enjoy the cleaner air and entertainment of coastal resorts. The SS Princess Alice was one such steamer, a 219-foot paddle steamer that regularly carried Londoners on day trips to Kent and back. The enthusiasm for tickets to take these pleasure boats wasn't so different from wanting a ticket to the next big footy match. People enjoy a brief respite from the grime and grind of daily life. On September 3, 1878, the Princess Alice was returning from a day trip to Kent, packed with passengers, mostly working-class Londoners, enjoying a rare day of leisure. As darkness fell, the Princess Alice approached Galleon's Reach, a dangerous bend in the Thames near Woolwich. At the same time, the Bywell Castle, a large coal ship, was heading downstream. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the two vessels collided. The exact cause remains disputed. The Princess Alice may have broken river navigation rules by crossing the Bywell Castle's path, while the Bywell Castle's helmsman may have misinterpreted orders. The much larger Bywell Castle struck the Princess Alice amidships, cutting the pleasure steamer almost in two. Survivor Alfred Thomas Merriman recalled, "The steamer broke in half, as if it was a piece of wood cut through with a knife." What might have been a tragic but straightforward drowning disaster was made infinitely worse by where it occurred. Just upstream from the collision site were the outlets of London's main sewage pumping stations at Crossness and Barking. That evening, as was the usual practice with the tides, the pumping stations had released approximately 75 million gallons of raw sewage into the Thames. The Princess Alice passengers were not just drowning in water, they were drowning in London's excrement. The water was so toxic that many who initially survived the sinking later died from ingesting the polluted water. Doctors reported that victims' bodies blackened unusually quickly and emitted a distinctive sewage stench. Rescue efforts were hampered by the darkness and the polluted conditions. Local boatmen were paid 5 shillings for each body they retrieved from the river. A diver who explored the wreck reported a horrifying scene. Bodies standing upright in cabins, crammed around exit points in their desperate attempt to escape. The exact death toll remains unknown, as no passenger list was kept, but historical estimates suggest between 600 and 700 people died in the disaster, making it the deadliest British inland waterway accident in history. Bodies were laid out in makeshift mortuaries across East London, with relatives forming long queues to identify their loved ones. Two separate investigations, an inquest and a Board of Trade inquiry, came to different conclusions about which vessel was at fault. However, both highlighted the inadequate river navigation rules and the dangerous state of the Thames. The disaster forced Victorian London to confront its environmental crisis. In the years following, significant improvements were made to London's sewage system, and stricter regulations were imposed on river traffic. New rules required ships to carry proper lighting, maintain safe speeds, and follow standardized navigation protocols, many of which remain in place today. It took hundreds of deaths to convince Victorian authorities that perhaps pumping raw sewage into a major shipping channel wasn't the most brilliant idea they'd ever had. These three Victorian maritime disasters, separated by decades and occurring in vastly different circumstances, each forced Victorian society to confront uncomfortable truths about the human cost of progress. The Essex disaster revealed the moral boundaries humans will cross when survival is at stake, bringing public attention to survival ethics that would later be addressed in maritime law. The Birkenhead disaster helped popularize the concept of women and children first that would influence maritime evacuation protocols for generations, establishing the principle that the most vulnerable should be saved first. The Princess Alice tragedy exposed the deadly environmental consequences of unchecked industrial development, leading to reforms that would eventually transform London's relationship with its famous river. Together, these disasters contributed to the gradual development of a framework for modern maritime safety that balances technological solutions, ethical protocols, and environmental considerations. A framework that continues to evolve and save lives today. As we face modern challenges, from climate change to technological disruption, these Victorian tragedies remind us that progress always carries a cost, and that safety measures written in blood should never be taken for granted. Despite their profound impact, these disasters have largely faded from public memory. Captain Pollard ended his days as an obscure night watchman. The soldiers of the Birkenhead are commemorated mainly in South Africa, not Britain. The Princess Alice victims lie in largely unmarked graves. This forgetting is itself revealing. Victorian society preferred to implement the lessons of these tragedies while distancing itself from the uncomfortable questions they raised about human nature, duty, and environmental responsibility. Yet the legacy of these forgotten disasters lives on in every modern lifeboat drill, in every maritime evacuation protocol, and in every environmental regulation governing our waterways. The next time you board a ferry and notice the lifeboats, participate in a safety drill, or see environmental protections in action, remember the forgotten victims of the Essex, the Birkenhead, and the Princess Alice, and how their tragedies shaped our safer world. What other forgotten disasters hold valuable lessons for our modern age? And what current practices might future generations look back on with the same horror that we view the Thames as an open sewer or ships without sufficient lifeboats? Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark waters of Victorian maritime history. If you found this exploration of Victorian maritime disasters enlightening, please subscribe for more historical stories that continue to shape our world today. After all, understanding our past is rather like brewing the perfect cup of tea. It requires patience, attention to detail, and an appreciation for the subtle flavors that linger long after the last sip.